Since the Israelites were freed from bondage in Egypt, they journeyed toward Canaan, the land God promised to Abraham, an inheritance for his descendants. However, throughout their journey and settlement, they repeatedly strayed from the laws, commandments, and instructions God had given Moses on Mount Sinai. This disobedience led to severe consequences, emphasizing the significance of remaining faithful to their covenant with the Lord. The book of Leviticus clearly outlines both the blessings for obedience and the penalties for rebellion. God established a solemn covenant with the Israelites, calling them to follow his commands, worship him alone, and reject idolatry. They were to avoid adopting the customs, practices, and gods of the surrounding nations. This covenant was not just a set of rules, but a sacred commitment that defined their identity as a holy people. In Leviticus 26-17, God warns of the repercussions of disobedience. "I will set my face against you, and you will be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee even when no one pursues you." This verse illustrates one of God's judgments if Israel abandoned the covenant. They would fall under the domination of their enemies and lose divine protection. Since the Israelites were freed from bondage in Egypt, they journeyed toward Canaan, the land God promised to Abraham, an inheritance for his descendants. However, throughout their journey and settlement, they repeatedly strayed from the laws, commandments, and instructions God had given Moses on Mount Sinai. This disobedience led to severe consequences, emphasizing the significance of remaining faithful to their covenant with the Lord. The book of Leviticus clearly outlines both the blessings for obedience and the penalties for rebellion. God established a solemn covenant with the Israelites, calling them to follow his commands, worship him alone, and reject idolatry. They were to avoid adopting the customs, practices, and gods of the surrounding nations. This covenant was not just a set of rules, but a sacred commitment that defined their identity as a holy people. In Leviticus 26-17, God warns of the repercussions of disobedience. "I will set my face against you, and you will be defeated by your enemies. Those who hate you will rule over you, and you will flee even when no one pursues you." This verse illustrates one of God's judgments if Israel abandoned the covenant. They would fall under the domination of their enemies and lose divine protection. This penalty not only signified a separation from God's presence, but also had dire consequences. The tribes of Israel could be subjugated, scattered, or assimilated into surrounding cultures and nations. This recurring cycle of disobedience and divine judgment is a central theme in Israel's history, underscoring the importance of faithfulness to God in order to receive the blessings of his covenant. In Leviticus 26-25, God further details the consequences of their rebellion. "I will bring enemy nations against you, wielding the sword to avenge my covenant. When you seek refuge in your cities, I will send a plague among you, and you will fall into the hands of your adversaries." The Israelites had broken their sacred covenant, turning to idolatry and adopting the sinful practices of neighboring peoples. As a result, God permitted their subjugation by foreign nations, allowing their enemies to dominate their land. Historical records confirm this, as described by the prophet Hosea 8-4, who denounced the last kings of Israel as illegitimate usurpers of the throne. When the tribes abandoned God in favor of idolatry, they were handed over to rival nations vying for territorial control, reducing them to vassals. This period of decline significantly shaped the fate of the 12 tribes, leading to widespread speculation about their eventual dispersion. Some believe the tribes were absorbed into other civilizations, while others argue that they retain their identity in secrecy. This apparent disappearance has fueled both theological and historical debates, prompting continued investigation into how God's covenant with Israel remains relevant today. One of the most intriguing yet controversial theories suggests that the so-called lost tribes of Israel were actually ancestors of indigenous groups in the Americas. According to this view, some indigenous peoples could be direct descendants of the dispersed Israelites. However, despite its longevity, this theory lacks both biblical and scientific validation. Genetic studies have consistently shown that indigenous populations of the Americas have predominantly Asian origins, tracing their ancestry to groups from Siberia, East Asia, and other regions. These findings are further supported by archaeological and linguistic evidence. Additionally, there are no significant physical or cultural similarities between indigenous groups of the Americas and the peoples of the ancient Middle East, making the theory even less plausible. Indigenous peoples exhibit traits that more closely link them to populations from the Far East, including the Chinese, Japanese, Mongols, and Siberians. Additionally, their cultural traditions and way of life differ significantly from those of the ancient Israelites. Supporters of this theory claim that the tribes of Israel eventually left their homeland and journeyed across the world to the Americas. However, this idea faces serious historical challenges. For instance, the indigenous peoples of the Americas did not possess Bronze Age technologies, such as the weapons and tools commonly used by the ancient Israelites. While the Israelites were known for their elaborate, colorful garments adorned with intricate fabrics, indigenous clothing styles were distinct, often featuring body paint, feather decorations, and minimal fabric use. Physical differences further challenge this theory. Ancient Semitic groups, including the Israelites, typically had more body hair, a trait not commonly observed among indigenous peoples of the Americas. These genetic, cultural, and historical distinctions make the claim of a direct connection between the lost tribes of Israel and indigenous American populations highly improbable. With advancements in genetic research, many of these ancient theories have been thoroughly debunked. Studies consistently show that indigenous peoples of the Americas share a stronger genetic link to Asian populations, which explains distinctive features such as almond-shaped eyes and straight hair. Some indigenous groups also exhibit a more brownish skin tone, likely resulting from intermixing with ancient Cushitic peoples, descendants of Ham. However, their primary genetic lineage remains of Asian origin, aligning more closely with Togarmah's descendants in biblical accounts. If indigenous peoples of the Americas shared significant genetic similarities with Israelites, modern Jews, or other Semitic populations from the Middle East, there might be a basis for considering them descendants of the lost tribes. However, current scientific and historical evidence does not support this connection. However, genetic studies reveal that no such similarity exists. In fact, there is no significant genetic relationship between indigenous peoples of the Americas and those from the Middle East. In contrast, populations such as Arabs, Syrians, and Lebanese share a strong genetic affinity with Jews, reflecting their common ancestral origins. Therefore, it can be concluded that the indigenous peoples of the Americas cannot be classified as the lost tribes of Israel. This finding highlights the importance of modern genetic research in debunking theories based on speculation, while providing a deeper understanding of the origins and historical connections between various ethnic groups around the world, African tribes. Another theory that has gained popularity similar to the idea that indigenous peoples are descendants of the lost tribes of Israel is the notion that certain African groups also have ancestry linked to these tribes. However, this perspective directly contradicts both contemporary Judaism and ancient Jewish traditions, including accounts from over 1,000 years ago. According to historians such as Flavius Josephus, Africans are traditionally considered descendants of Ham, particularly from the lineages of Cush, Mizraim, and Put, who are regarded as the ancestors of African peoples. On the other hand, some theorists propose that certain African populations are actually descendants of the lost tribes of Israel. However, this claim lacks biblical, historical, and genetic evidence. Genetic studies show no significant connection between African groups and Middle Eastern populations, such as Arabs and Jews, further reinforcing the idea that Africans are primarily Hamitic rather than Semitic in origin. Despite various claims of Jewish descent, the only widely recognized group with Jewish African ancestry is the Ethiopian Jewish community. Ethiopian Jews, while carrying Jewish heritage, are often referred to as Cushitic Jews due to their primary lineage tracing back to Cush, linking them to many other African groups, including Ethiopians, Eritreans, Somalis, and related populations in the region. In biblical accounts, the Kingdom of Cush, which included Nubia, corresponds to present-day Sudan. On the other hand, indigenous peoples of the Americas are generally considered to be descendants of Togarmah, a figure associated in biblical tradition with the lineage of Japheth. Meanwhile, most African peoples are thought to be descendants of Ham and his three sons Mizraim, Cush, and Put, whose descendants spread across regions such as Libya and other parts of Africa. This interpretation aligns more closely with the traditional biblical narrative and the well-established historical ancestry of various ethnic groups. In addition to this theory, there are also various European hypotheses regarding the lost tribes of Israel. Some theories claim that the lost tribes of Israel ended up in Europe, Africa, or the Americas. However, historical, genetic, and biblical evidence contradicts these ideas. For instance, some argue that the British or Anglo-Saxons were Israelites, but this theory misinterprets biblical texts, such as describing David as ruddy, which refers to a sun-kissed complexion rather than red hair. Similarly, claims that indigenous Americans or African nations descend from the lost tribes lack genetic and historical support. Civilizations like the Mayans, Aztecs, and Incas existed long before the formation of Israel, while African peoples descendants of Cush, Mizraim, and Put were well established long before the Israelites emerged. The only African group with known Jewish heritage, Ethiopian Jews, often linked to Cush, other than Israelite ancestry. Historically, the lost tribes were deported to Assyria after the conquest of Samaria in 722 BC to Kings 17-6. They were never sent to Africa, as Assyria was in direct conflict with Egypt. Over time, they assimilated into Middle Eastern populations under successive empires, including the Babylonians, Persians, Greeks, Romans, and Arabs. The New Testament confirms that Israelites from various tribes still existed, such as Anna from the tribe of Asher, to 36, and Paul from the tribe of Benjamin. This proves that the tribes were not lost in distant lands, but absorbed into local societies. Ultimately, biblical prophecy is fulfilled in Jesus Christ, who established Christians as the new Israel. Galatians 3:28. Through him, the distinction between Jew and Gentile disappears, uniting all believers under God's spiritual kingdom. As the Apostle Paul states, in Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek. Galatians 3:28. The mixing of Israelite tribes with Assyrian and Middle Eastern peoples was not accidental, but part of God's divine plan. In the end times, these tribes will recognize their Israelite heritage, turn to Christ, and be saved. However, salvation is not based on ancestry, but on faith in Christ. God's purpose is to redeem all people, regardless of ethnicity, language, or origin. What truly matters is accepting God as Father and believing in Christ. Thus, all who follow Christ regardless of their background will be saved, not just Israelites or Semites. May God bless you, and see you soon.